quite a world of administration. He's now the director of the architecture program, so my condolences. But thank you for getting away. It's much more fun to leave when you're an administrator. Since 2000, Jeff has also practiced in collaboration with E.B. Min as Min Day, an office with offices in both San Francisco and Omaha. I don't want to steal anything because it's by two offices. It's an interesting story in that it seems, and I will be corrected momentarily, that the office was formed largely because the partners were no longer in the same city. So it was an office formalized by the fact that they would be in two different places and have a kind of continental divide between them, between San Francisco and Omaha, which I think is an interesting way to form a partnership, knowing that you're going to be separated by a couple thousand miles. The work, though, has certainly benefited from that collaboration and that gap, and I think maybe it's of some reassurance to us that at least conceptually the experimental work gets to happen in the Midwestern context of Omaha more than the enlightened context of the West Coast sibling office. We may hear also more about that. In addition to Jeff's professional practice, which has won many awards, including, I'll just list a few, the 2007 AIA California Council Emerging Talent Award, the 2009 New Practices San Francisco Award, California Home Design's 10 to Watch in 2009, Residential Architects 2010 Rising Star Award, and Architectural Record Magazine's 2009 Design Vanguard Award, as well as many AIA awards. And I think that in addition to his practice, also at UNL, Jeff is also responsible for running FACT, which is the Fabrication and Construction Team, a kind of academic, professional, quasi in the academy, quasi in practice research and design entity that sort of crosses boundaries, and then also in 2013 won the ACSA, the inaugural ACSA Design Build Award. And I think it's really maybe both the work and his education practice that I think is of interest to us. Not only does the work itself span all of the scales that we find resonance with, namely from furniture to landscape to architecture to planning, but also really at the intersection, you could say, of technology and art. That Jeff's work really is at the forefront of introducing new technologies into the construction and design and conceptualization of architecture, but also with a grounding in kind of historical and contemporary art practices, particularly people that we know, like Smithson, Michael Heiser, and others. And so this maybe for Jeff, architecture is the sort of the intersection or the result of experiments in art and technology, as Robert Rauschenberg might say, is architecture. And I think that the issue of the way in which the scales work from interior furniture to really subdivision planning in China, the same sorts of organizational principles, regardless of whether it's a fabricated one-to-one effort or whether it's a much larger regional or territorial distribution system, the same logic and commitment to the precision of new technologies and maybe the discursive possibilities of the aesthetic realm. And so one of the concepts I think that Jeff has introduced into discussions today, which is that of uselessness in a world, I think, saturated by questions of, we've talked about many times before, metrics of utility and utilitarianism, that there also has to be a degree for architecture of uselessness, and it's really this free zone, you could say, of uselessness that sets out cultural and discursive possibilities of architecture against its background of satisfying particular uses, or at least makes possible future uses that aren't yet conceived of. So we welcome Jeff to UIC, and also to help us think about our uselessness.
Thanks very much, Bob. It's really great to be here at the school, and it is the first time I've actually been in the building. But I had a student do a thesis project a few years ago that was sited near here. It was called an Omni building. It was an 8 million square foot building for United Airlines and Continental. It sort of floated above the circle and kind of about 6 blocks away from here. So it dumped down into the school and made a connection to the ground here. And quite interesting to actually be here, I think. due to displacement.
It's going to happen in reality.
Yeah. The other thing is I'm quite relieved that when I got the invitation to speak here, I was of course flattered and really excited about it, but the date was April 1st, and I thought, I think Paul Price was pulling some kind of evil trick. I'm going to speak to this empty room and no one's here, and it runs through break or something. But fortunately, there were some people here, and it looks like a great audience. I also had a talk with the two editors of the Fresh Meat this afternoon, and they asked me two questions, which just so happened to be the way that I'm actually beginning my lecture. And that is that really what I want to talk about through the work is how an architect or a firm frames its practice, and how one can do that without having to narrowly constrain what you actually do. And it really comes from questions that we've been asked by a number of people over the years. And the first one is, well, why two offices? And that's a kind of obvious question. We've got an office in San Francisco and an office in Omaha. No one's really surprised about an office in San Francisco, but they ask, well, why Omaha and San Francisco, which is not a combination you normally hear of. And there is a circumstance. Basically, we were separated, my business partner and I, by a number of miles, but the practice actually started after separation. So we were in the city, occasionally doing competitions, but working for different architects. And then when I moved to Omaha, we started this practice. So we were actually worked in the same office for more than a few days at a time, which if you're ever in the same office with us for more than a few days at a time, you probably know why. Most of our practice involves a lot of argument, and it usually ends up getting us to some productive place. E.B. Mann, my business partner, is based in San Francisco, and she worked for a landscape firm, Delaney and Cochran. It's now Andrea Cochran Landscape Architecture. It's a pretty well-known Bay Area landscape firm. Prior to starting the practice, so there's a strong sort of ethic of working in a constructed landscape. But I think the real answer to the question, apart from the circumstance, is that we are quite happy to be inhabiting very different cultures, extremely different landscapes, and dealing with this is actually Denver, but it's flat as well. But it's actually the airport where I spend a lot of time on the way back and forth to San Francisco, so it's sort of maybe a third office. But I think one of the ideas here behind having multiple offices is it gives us the freedom to resist the culture of the place we're in and not get too sucked into a sort of stylistic overlay. If you go to San Francisco, you'll see a contemporary architecture brand, if you will, that sort of pervades a lot of the sort of mid-sized firms in that city that do work in the city. And some, like Stanley Sadowitz, find a way to get outside of that and do work that's really strong. And for us, the way to get out of that is to actually be connected to a lot of different places. I guess the last sort of way that this dual office environment works for us is it gives us the belief that we can actually work in any location, that we don't have to be tied to where we are necessarily based. So we were doing a project in Chicago right now. We were recently hired to do a residence and studio for an experimental jazz musician in Palmetto, Florida. We've got a project in Wyoming and a few other locations. So we tend to be sort of spread fairly thin, if you will, but we still feel that we can go somewhere and capture what we need to about a particular place. Last year we actually had 4 offices, but these were sort of temporary. 2 of them were temporary. We had a small office in an apartment in the Aqua Tower for about a year. One of our staff members was living there and working on some of the projects in Chicago and other places. And I was living in London, so we sort of distributed our office even further. We almost got to the point of having 1 office per person in the firm, but we missed about 1. So we're working on that. I guess the thing to say about this, maybe the last thing about the notion of the office, is that we think of it more as a distributed practice, not a network practice. We're not structured in the way firms like Servo and others that are really based on individuals collaborating loosely. We still work together quite often. Almost all of the projects that I'm going to show you involve people in both offices working together collaboratively or working long distance. So it's a different model. It's maybe not quite as radical as the network practice, a bit more complicated. And then the second question people ask is, what kind of architecture do you do? And we hired a branding person at one point to help us figure this out. We were having the hardest time writing a statement about our practice that we both could agree on. And finally, so I hired someone to write something for us that just sort of got it outside of our own personalities. And I think it really is about innovation. For a long time, people would ask this question, and we would just sort of resist, or one of us would just talk endlessly until we get the right words. But we sort of resist the kind of specialization or expertise that some firms seek out within housing, healthcare projects, et cetera, institutional projects. Nor do we have any sort of overarching project or sort of research agenda. Stan Allen talks about practice versus project, a kind of architecture that is responsive to the circumstances that architecture encounters as a practice, as opposed to delivering a sort of theoretical agenda and then trying to build that. And we've tended to try to resist any sort of overarching notions of sort of framing of the kind of ideas behind the work and let the ideas come out of the projects themselves. But there is a need to, as a professional, to actually say what you do, and at some point to try to package that. And so we looked at a number of different ways of doing this. How do you organize a sort of disparate set of work? Well, obviously OMA at one point organized its work based on size. This is not a non-traditional way of organizing a collection of projects beyond sort of conventional categorization, say residential versus commercial, et cetera. And then FOA looked at projects in terms of phylogenesis as a kind of genealogical taxonomy that starts to find ideas for one project, how they relate and grow through other projects, how they might hybridize or bifurcate and become a sort of strand of projects. And that seemed a little bit sort of complicated and really, again, forcing something into our work that isn't really there. And then BIG's website is interesting in the sense that one can, as a visitor to the website, one is given a set of 5 pre-coded organizations. This is just a dead slide, but if I was to click on this, if you know this website, if you hit alphabetical, all the projects we organize in terms of their sort of name, or their program, scale, or status. One can sort of endlessly start to do this. But in a sense, this isn't really that different from organizing around the conventional categories of buildings. So for last year, this sort of holiday card, we decided to organize projects by color. And why not? It's sort of something that's a sort of common theme in our work, as you'll see. And so the card is sort of a gradation of color through the work. In a sense, it doesn't really matter. You can kind of do whatever you want. And our previous website, we had sort of 2 versions of this website. This is the second one. We actually started with a website that organized the projects by site characteristics. So we had suburban, urban, rural, and inside, which organized interior projects to sort of large-scale rural projects. And then we switched to this more conventional organization based on some marketing advice. We're having a hard time filling hours for the house. They didn't know whether they go rural or suburban, or where the houses. And actually, our best houses are not necessarily where you might expect to find them. So it was interesting intellectually, but not very practical from the point of view of actually trying to get hired, which is part of what we want to do. So our new website is interesting to us, at least, because it's non-hierarchical and it's an apparent random array. Obviously, we select which projects that are presented here, but the work can be reorganized in any way. There is no sort of innate organization behind this. And in fact, what we really do is, if we have to say, someone's going to, interview, we're going to interview someone for a particular kind of project, we kind of secretly slide relevant projects up near the top so that they show up when they first come to the site, slip them around. And it changes, week to week at least. I wouldn't say day to day, but quite often. So this, in a way, sort of freed us up from thinking about this problem of how do we organize our work, how do we describe what we do, and just let it be there. And somehow we feel that this captures what we do, and we don't really need to say much more. So finally, we just decided we're just going to stop worrying about this and learn to love the plurality. The movie the American is what I just said. So again, the idea here is to really say to ourselves and to our interlocutors and clients and so on that we're pretty much open to anything. We do almost any kind of project. We don't tell a client that we don't do bathroom remodels anymore. In fact, we just took on a bathroom remodel project that is really pretty amazing. It's a backlit Korean bathroom where all the lighting comes through the wall. There's not a single fixture inside the space, and it's something we're working on right now. So there's no point in trying to sort of define the work and equate that way. But one of the things that we try to resist is the idea that architecture tends to be defined negatively. Architects say, well, I don't like that kind of work, or architecture is not ordinary building. It's always sort of a negative sort of way of defining the practice of architecture, the discipline of architecture. And then, organizations such as the AIA tend to try to pull architecture away from its engagement in various ways with contractors, with developers, and so on, and taking away responsibility, saying no, no, no to so many different aspects of what maybe at one time used to be considered architecture. And so we're really tired of the sort of no, and believe that we need to start saying anything goes, and we're open to saying yes as often as possible. So the nature of the practice here is the two offices. It's my partner and I. It's a number of people who work with us, but we also work with FACT, and Bob mentioned this as Fabrication and Construction Team, which is a sort of loosely confederated design-build practice. I don't really like the term design-build, because it's not exactly what we do, but it is a sort of category that we do fit into in academic circles. So FACT works with Minday on a lot of projects. Minday works on all FACT projects. In one way or another, the office is engaged in all the projects that the students are working on through FACT. FACT operates in three different ways. Through a course that is an elective offering at the University of Nebraska. Students take the course for 3 credits, up to 6 credits, and work on the project during the sort of academic session, usually a semester or summer. Students can be involved in independent study, which means they're a little bit outside of the constraints of the semester, but still getting academic credit, or students are hired as interns through various granting agencies and some university funding, which means they're completely outside of the academic calendar, and they tend to be working more as interns in the office at that point. And so FACT is a vehicle for Minday, and it's a way that we engage pro bono projects, working with nonprofit organizations. Most often these are creative nonprofits, small art centers, and so on. We're working with a number of different art centers in the Midwest, and trying to start thinking about how to work with art centers further afield. We're currently working with one, I'm not going to show images from this one, but in Kansas, in Salina Art Center. It's about a 4-hour drive. So to try to figure out how to do a student-led design build project 4 hours away, where I can't send the students down there every week to fix something, is a real challenge. So it's forced us to think about how work can be done in a prefabricated way, and how we can outsource certain aspects of those projects. And so we're becoming a little bit more nimble in our collaborations. Art Farm is one of the long-term client partners that we've had with FACT. It's began almost 10 years ago when we were asked to help Art Farm reorganize this 40-acre space. It's a nonprofit art residency program. Artists would spend the summer living in salvaged buildings, making work, and it's an interesting framework for an institution because it almost operates outside of the financial system. The annual budget is about $3,000 for a 40-acre property with 15 buildings. There's no air conditioning. There's electricity. That's about it. It's essentially like a kind of rural camping. And artists are not paid anything. They don't pay anything. It's a sort of an arrangement where an artist will show up. We tend to get about 400 applications a year for about 24 spots. And the artists will be residents for a certain period of time, and they have to give back about 5 hours of work a week. And so construction projects tend to happen through artist labor. But the artists build work. I mean, this has been there for a long time. I'm not going to comment on its artistic merit, but they work with salvaged materials. They work with 20 acres of open land and do whatever they will. But it's a kind of institution that deals very much with the contingencies of rural life. We have prairie fires that sometimes get close to our buildings, tornadoes occasionally, a lot of interesting things happen. There's always bugs, but it's a really interesting place to work outside of the controlled environment of the earth when we talk about architecture. And that notion of being outside of control is really important to how we started to work with Art Farm. And Bob mentioned Smithson. Of course, here's a drawing by Robert Smithson. It's a sketch for his project in Rome called the Asphalt Floor. And the idea here, he's got a few sketches to show this sort of beautiful river of black asphalt sort of going down, solidifying, becoming a sort of index of the process, the entropic process of dumping asphalt. However, when he got to Rome and got a truck and bought some asphalt, it just kind of dumped on the side. Doesn't really look that great. And yet for Smithson, that's actually important. Smithson's work is very much about entropy, although in many ways it's a representation of entropy, and I've talked about that for a while. But I think for us, as architects, it's a sort of clue that we need to sort of set something in motion and stand away and not allow it to be overly controlled by our particular design agenda. So when we started working with Art Farm, we really focused a lot on the organization of the region within which it sits, which is Great Plains farmland. It's the sort of most evident sort of installation of the Jefferson grid. And we really started to think about how we could sort of capitalize on these obsolete mathematics, based on oxen and surveying from the equipment from the 17th century. You can almost tell the days that they drank too much whiskey and the lines are kind of going all over the place. It's really interesting to see this sort of pure Enlightenment idea of this sort of abstraction mapped onto the real earth. And what I find interesting about it is that you see the grid as not its abstract form, but as the physical properties that accrue to it over time. So roads are built, fences are put out, farms are graded, and so you start to see the physicality of this abstraction start to emerge in the landscape. So at Art Farm, we wanted to find a way to, in a sense, condense that into a single property. Just set something loose and let it go. And so it's kind of a game board strategy. This is how we found 40 acres at Art Farm, collection of buildings, and through, you kind of get the idea. There's a sort of collection of a miniature sort of Jeffersonian grid established on the site. There's a subset of the measurement system. It's a 66-foot grid. And then a series of sort of plantations that are sort of monocultural, so individual species of trees planted in these clusters, and then networks of circulation. But Art Farm persists because of the collection of farm buildings. And in the farm crisis in the 70s and 80s, the man Ed Dady, who founded Art Farm, started buying entire farmsteads for a few $100s. And you get a whole collection of buildings and find ways of salvaging materials or moving the buildings to the site. And then we came along, we bought this house for $400, and it cost about $3,000 to move it to the property. And we're using currently the steel from the sort of carriage that was on to fabricate the various towers. And it's an extremely slow process because we're really only getting work when students out live or when the artists are there in the summer, students and shared labor. And it's all salvage material, so there's really, it's probably the slowest project that we've ever worked on. Yet it's still more or less following its plan. We did have the opportunity, a kind of interesting opportunity to curate our own show at the Sheldon Museum in Lincoln, which is a 50-year-old Philip Johnson building, turns 50 this year. We're having a celebration. In fact, in May, Robert Stern's coming out to do a lecture about Johnson. And this is one of Johnson's sort of temple-like art museums. It's similar to the Hanging Carter in Fort Worth, and it's a sort of simple plan, but with this great atrium-like space in the center. And we were asked to do a show of our work, our design work for Art Farm, but also the production of artists at Art Farm. So we curated a few pieces from the artists But to really capture it, we convinced the museum to let us move a 100-year-old farm shed into the museum. I don't have images of it moving in, but because this building was built at a time when paintings were about 8 feet tall, and the doors are 8 feet tall, and there's nothing bigger than 8 feet can move into this building, so there's no loading dock. It's just artwork that moves through the glass doors. It's very interesting. So we had to dismantle this structure, bring it in, and assemble it, and then we built an interior environment that was very different from the exterior, as a kind of continuous surface of stabilized foam. And then we showed video work by artists media artists from Art Farm, and just allow people to lounge in here and watch the films over the course of an afternoon or day. But really getting very interested here in the sort of appearance of this building, sort of just barely stabilized inside this travertine hall, becomes a kind of interesting way of thinking about the temporality of buildings like this. The farm culture of the Midwest is such that these buildings aren't viewed nostalgically as sort of beautiful barns the way they might be in New England. They're really utilitarian pieces of machinery. And a farmer does not hesitate to break it down, stick a shed, a sort of grain bin inside it, or whatever they will. And so rehabilitating them in a sort of non-conventional way is actually the norm in the Midwest. And I guess I'm interested in sort of thinking about how the work that we do, we strive for something, as Richet says, that good art should be elicit a response of wow, as opposed to wow. In other words, you want people to be perplexed and think about something and realize that there's something really exciting going on there, rather than having to be sort of wowed by some formal innovation and realize that it's nothing more than that. And so we're trying to sort of find a way that there's nuances within this work that maybe outlive the initial confusion that it might elicit at times. Prices are getting a little bit higher. We bought this barn for $1,000, and it cost $7,000 to move it to Art Farm. And we are, of course, very slowly working on it. In fact, we had a design for the barn and then moved it, and really loved the way that it just sort of floated above the ground. So when it was on this truck. And so currently it's sort of propped about 4 feet off the plane. And we've had an engineer who's designed a structural system so that there's a concrete core that supports the major columns, and then the walls on the outside are really just very lightweight skirts. So there's small steel members that support that, and those are starting to be installed now. And then the section on the interior, there's a storm cellar, which is also used for art storage, and then the gallery in the center. It's more or less a white cube gallery environment. And then the outer galleries are sort of above this glass skirt. It's all the work that we installed on the walls, sculpture on the floor, and so on, with this plain prairie quite visible from the outside. And a bare minimum of light controls that allow this to be a very living kind of art environment. And I think that the notion of a long-term relationship with a client, like Art Farm, is really important to us. We're not only just designing and trying to build structures for them, physical enclosure, and work with landscape, but helping them find ways of branding, helping with fundraising, really serve a sort of wide range of purposes with these nonprofits. And in the case of Art Farm, we become board members because we're doing so much work and we're getting paid, which at least we feel like we're part of the client team. So we sort of work with Art Farm, artist selection, and other things. So it's the long-term relationship that I think is really critical in these projects. But the interest in landscape translates from this also to buildings themselves. This is a competition entry for the David Wilson Library. We entered this as a competition last summer. It was due in August or something like that. As typical, there were about 800 entries to the competition, and we didn't win, but it was a great experiment for us to work on building this scope, because we don't typically get commissions of this scale. But in this case, it's a library in Daegu, which is a city of about 1 million or so, Korea, and mountainous valley. And it sits on a major road. There's a lot of apartment buildings around it, and a sort of park. It sits right at the edge of an L-shaped park. The program sort of given by the client is a sort of typical library trying to become a media center, sort of trying to be the Seattle Public Library, basically. This is what they gave us. But the program is nothing really dramatic. And so we started to think about how do we start to categorize this, sort of separate public areas from service areas, and then taking all the media and collecting that into a single element of the program in this sort of gold color in the center. And then starting to disperse information services so that staff would not be located in offices, but they'd be sort of roaming throughout. So the gray, sort of loose gradient at the bottom represents this sort of distribution of employees, so that they're sort of flowing through this building. And then, quite literally, we sort of took this diagram and started to create a three-dimensional space out of it. This sort of becomes this one tube with the media core and this service and storage area sort of pulled outside of that. And then the tube is sort of wrapped up in this sort of snake-like form, connecting to the park, and then a view of the mountain. If you get up a little bit higher, you can see over the smaller buildings and counter view of the mountains. And so that it's a connection between the urban landscape and the sort of mountainous landscape around the space. And then, of course, consolidating that, wrapping around the media core is utility basement. And then inside, you can see this sort of unfurled section. There's a series of tiered areas to try to maintain the continuity of that space as you jump floors. And those become really important project social spaces where people can lounge on the stairs. They start to take definition of the children's reading room has a certain characteristic, there's a slide in it, and so on and so forth. And then the basement plan, for no point in dwelling on these, but you can see that the gold core sits in the center, and then as one gets to the very, very top, there's a view out. And one can keep going, well, that sounds very cool now, but as you get to the very top, you can go up onto the roof, and it continues up, and there's a kind of ha-ha detail on the roof, so there's only guardrails, and one can lounge up there at the top. And then the core itself takes on a very kind of dynamic character with bronze shelving, robots that get the books, which unfortunately we didn't have to actually figure out. And spaces sort of zooming around. So the social spaces and the reading rooms are outside of this core. And then each of those, as I mentioned, have these tiered zones, different proportions. This kind of crude diagram shows in orange the landscape of the surfaces that are accessible, popping out of the core at different levels. And then finally, a rendering of this from the other side. You can see that the park at the base starts to move in and then become part of this landscape rolling up and view of both buildings in the back room. The idea of sort of framing and constructing landscape in this way is something that is evident in a few projects. And this one is a house in Iowa. And it's on a lake about 3 hours from Omaha in the direction of Minneapolis. It's about 3 hours from Minneapolis as well. And it's a deep water lake, which there aren't very many in this part of the Midwest. So it's very popular as a resort for boating and sailing and whatnot. And so approaching, this is from an airplane, but flying over this landscape is a fairly monotonous farmland, actually fairly attractive farmland. And then the property is right at this point at the south end of the major lake. And you can sort of see a green sort of veneer of trees around the lake. That's the entire sort of zone of habitation around this lake, and immediately into cornfields. So you go from land that is maybe $4,000 an acre to land that is sold at $1,000 per inch of lakefront. So our clients have 120 lakefronts. It's over $1 million to buy what was a tiny little piece of land in the middle of nowhere. And that's just for land. But what's odd and sort of somewhat disappointing about this, I'm from New England, and I'm used to sort of beautiful lakes and so on, and this isn't exactly the most beautiful place. And there's a lot of these sort of suburban kind of tracks around, a few cottages, very tightly compacted, and it's all about getting to the lake. And And so for our clients, they kept saying, it's all about the lake, it's all about the lake. It's a vacation home, they go there just to go into the lake. So it became very clear that we need to construct a kind of environment that takes them away from this sort of suburban realm and focuses on the lake itself. But in addition to the lake, there's this sort of beautiful tree canopy and this sort of really nice dappled light on the grass that surrounds the lawn. And so thinking about that as well. So we came to a project that is about a 6,000 square foot house, but it's constructed around a series of spatial blinders or frames that focus views in certain ways and house the major elements of the program in a kind of new box, or this collection of boxes that very carefully push out cantilever off retaining walls to get closer to the trees, root systems, and getting right out to setbacks. So the major space on the ground floor is open on many of its sides. It's very much about being open to this view, capturing a view of the sky above the kitchen. And then on the second floor, a series of these framed spaces that are more tube-like that capture views both back to the woods that separate the houses from the farmland and then out to the lake. And so there's a series of different ways of engaging the site, very pragmatic ways to plinth, as I said, to allow for cantilevers and to get the basement above the water table, which is quite high, as you may imagine. And then a sort of reflective, almost repetition of the site. The building becomes a kind of surface upon which the projects, the upper levels of the house tend to sort of sit themselves somewhat loosely. And then the framing element that I mentioned before. So the plans are worth, again, looking at it too long, but there's, in addition to those major spaces that are colored, there are a lot of small rooms that were required in the program. So the exterior, again, is clad in ipe, which is a sustainably harvested hardwood, and then stained. We actually let it weather. The owners love the color so much to keep it. So they went from telling us they wanted zero maintenance house to one that has to get restained every year, which is interesting. And then a fairly discreet entry that's sort of tucked into a little alcove. There's a path that sort of brings one through grass. The light in the base, actually the basement's wider than the building above, so there's a glass sheet above 10 feet wide that extends beyond and lets light into the basement. And then the entry sort of, as you move through, you start to get a better sense of the water and the lakefront. And then into that main entry space, capturing that view a little bit more. And then as you sort of get into the kitchen, the view actually becomes quite expansive. So the section starts to open up. Because of the careful sighting, when you get out to this very end, you also get edges of the water. And then opening up to the decks. It's typically used as a summer vacation home, so the large garage doors were really important in terms of trying to deal with that. And then at the very end, it becomes almost this sort of diamonds stone glass. So the kitchen was an interesting feature because you couldn't really capture any views out to the wall because of the fact that there's a neighbor about 5 feet away from this house. So we built this 10-foot by 10-foot skylight that's sort of up at an angle above the room, and then wrapped the interior of that with polycarbonate. So there's actually a curtain wall on the outside of it that lets natural light through, and then the interstitial spaces lit with fluorescent tubes. So at night it starts to shift gradually from a daylit space to a officially lit space, and slowly transitions its temperature and its aspect to become something that's more sort of an entertainment zone within the center of the house. The owners really were interested in being very unconventional, I guess, in materials, like letting sort of rough concrete into the interior, and some of these walls sort of floating in and out, and then metal grating that we used for guardrails. Steel fabricated stair that flows into that window actually faces the neighbor, so it's with frosted glass to prevent obviously views. And this is directly off of the Jean Base. The guys from Fresh Meat kind of accused me of giving up the secrets of things too often, so we tend to show off diagrams, probably show too much sometimes. So this is one of the areas in the house where you can really understand the spatial quality of those rooms, where it's curtain walls on either end and then sort of tubular spaces running through the house. There's actually some areas where you can see through 3 of them. And then the interior is shielded from the neighbors by windows that are covered with wooden slats on the exterior. The windows actually open in so they can let natural light through, but they obscure the view of the adjacent home. And we did all the interior furnishings and fabrics and so on, curtains and all of that. But we became, in this project was the first project of a series where we became really interested in using color as a volumetric space-making strategy. And so within this house, there's a series of sort of color palette we developed, but then it's gradated from larger rooms that have a more muted quality, and then smaller rooms, bathrooms and stuff, intimate spaces are incredibly intense in terms of their color. And the idea here was to sort of shift the environment from one that's very focused on the site and open to reflections and views, to one that becomes very focused on its interior environment, to try to create an environment that's almost a pure interiority. And so these little bedrooms for the 3 children, run them now, they were entering high school when we did the house. And they were each given these tiny little rooms, absolutely as small as possible, which was like our clients, their parents' notion that they didn't want them playing, on their iPads or playing with computer games in their bedrooms. They wanted them out, so they made the rooms as small as absolutely possible. So the kids had to come out, and then they got this big playroom that we gave them, where they could be together. So it was really about creating a social environment that's different from their regular full-time home. There's 6 different bathrooms in the house, and these are 4 of them. Each one is a different color. As intense as possible, although the concrete floor is the one sort of unifying element in all of these rooms. We even got the clients to buy, towels that match, but then started they were into it. So one of the things that we like about the house is that during the day it has this muted quality, but then at night the colors and light starts to come out and it starts to maybe give up some of its interior character. Some of these intimate spaces actually start to become the things that actually give it character in its neighborhood. Another project where color became a really critical tool was a house for a filmmaker in Omaha. And we were hired to do this home in a building here. You can see it on the right. It's a 1920s era hotel. It's an Art Deco hotel. And it was developed by a local developer to a series of condominiums, but the top floor was sold to clients, and those purchasers, buyers were allowed to hire their own architects. So for most of it, it was sort of a plain vanilla renovation, but we were able to do some interesting things, including build this roof deck so the blue towel that kind of moves through the space actually emerges on the roof as an environment up here that extends the living room up to the roof. A couple of interesting things about it. One, we were allowed to do 400 square feet of deck, but put fake grass down on the roof. We just call it roofing, so that he actually has, about 600 square feet that he can actually occupy. But it doesn't count as roof deck. It's not a deck. It's fake grass. And then the other thing is the developer's office is directly across in that basement there. And he saw us paint the interior of this bright blue. He's like, wait a minute, that is not at all cool. Because if you go back, you can see the rest of the roof structures are this sort of beigey color that matches the limestone. This was this very intense blue. He was very upset about it. It didn't meet his notion of trying to restore this building. But we told him it was just interior paint. So what do you do? You can't tell the guy to paint his interior color. So we finally, after a lot of discussion about this, came to a conclusion that when our client, who also lives in Los Angeles, probably about 2/3 of the time, when he's not there, he'll lower the shades so you can see the blue. But our client's a bit cheeky, so he just turns the lights on and leaves town for a few days and lets the blue show through. We haven't heard more complaints. I think we've learned to live with it at this point. But it's we call it the L residence for kind of obvious reasons. That the space of the apartment is sort of wrapped in this corner. And it's very constrained because of plumbing issues and HVAC, and there wasn't a lot that we could do. So in terms of locations for some of the plumbing, it was really held to these inner walls. But it did allow us to free up the outer walls to create a kind of loft-like environment. And we started to become really interested in trying to think about sort of virtual crochet from Baroque, the spaces that inhabit the walls of Baroque churches. Become really figured spaces, and then there's sort of the major figure that occupies the center that is essentially the public realm. And so all the color in this apartment really occurs in these interstitial sort of virtual crochet spaces. And there's the sort of mezzanine level of the tower as you sort of come down into the evening. I should put 2 plans in there because it's interesting to see it in 2 different ways. One is where there's such a read just as space, and the other is where the crochet is really inverted from the rest of the drawing. But in this case, you can really start to see those sort of spatial division, and then the angles and sort of convolutions of the space inside the crochet. And then as you move up, it starts to become a little bit less clear, and then at the roof, it's this roof deck, and just the tower projecting above that. We really wanted to try to experiment a little bit with the way that materials come together and to resist this sort of tectonic idea of expressing materials in their sort of innate state. So someone might say that, well, a 3/4 inch plywood should show a 3/4 inch edge and have a feel behind it before it gets in the material, blah, blah, blah. But this was really an attempt to think about veneer as veneer, so that the plywood is a veneer, so we only see the veneer, and then the glue comes right to that edge, and there's really no sense of the depth of any materials in there. And the owner was really interested in trying to sort of pursue a kind of ornamentation from the Art Deco for the building, and we really had a hard time imagining how we would sort of apply Art Deco ornament into this space without it looking completely hokey, and that probably wouldn't bother our clients so much, but it bothered us a lot. So we started to think about how ornament in the Art Deco and Art Nouveau is really derived from thinking about natural form and natural growth. And so we started to look at the grasslands in Nebraska, and this is another one of these instances where maybe we reveal too much of our methods, but we employ a lot of advanced technology in projects, but we also do things in a very straightforward way at the same time. So this is literally just scribbling on trace with a fat pen, and then optimizing that as a vector drawing, and then developing a script to try to replicate this in a somewhat unrepeated way so that we can create a sense of a pattern that derives from that form, but can be optimized for cutting. So then it's used to route through these panels to create 2 different conditions. One is a backlit sort of light fixture in the wall, and the other, as you can see on the right, is the sort of perforated plywood with the blue showing through. And that's just kind of a sort of diagram of that series. This is an interesting thing for those of you who work with contractors. Our painting contractor didn't realize he had to actually paint all those little holes when he did the job. They're like, you can't spray it because we're going to ruin the veneer. So there were a couple guys there for a lead painting tiny little holes. I don't think we're going to work with that painting contractor again when we come here. So it's interesting to see that discovery encouraged. We work on quite a bit of furniture. The only piece that I'm going to show is actually part of the house in Omaha, and it's the cabinet in the master bedroom at the end of the house. And it's the one place in this house where there is a sort of overt, sort of ornamental quality that derives from this place. It actually forms the sort of baffle, visual baffle as one enters this room, and it's a sort of supple milled surface of striated plywood. On the back side, as you enter the room, you face the same material but more conventional panelization of cabinetry doors sitting up on the stainless steel legs. So it sits up about a foot, and it's about 6 feet tall, about 11.5 feet wide. And as you see it, different light conditions, the light sort of reflects off of the surface, which is extremely smooth, and starts to sort of indicate the character. So some angles you don't really see it, some angles you see it quite dynamically. This is our secret inter-office communication system, working between these two offices. We picked the one with the smiling face on it, and then that's the sort of variation we built. It was basically we started trying to directly copy photographs and import them and then digitize them into three-dimensional surfaces. It wasn't that successful, so we did an animation in Maya, and then took the Maya animation and optimized that for a fabricator. So it was basically cut on a router, but then hand finished. So there's a tremendous amount of hand work in this to get the quality of the surface. And the sort of summary of this is that one of the things that we're interested in a lot of these kinds of applications in our projects is what we call surface tension, the sort of play between the sort of abstraction of the digital surface and the reality of the material that it's made from, and trying to find an imbalance between them. So that in this case, you see the really sort of subtle curve of the waveform. It's very little representation. And then the striation of the plywood that works against that to try to flatten it out. So certain views, you just see the plywood, and other views, you sort of actually pick up the curvature. So there's a bit of a sort of frisson between these two kinds of material conditions and form conditions. This project here is called Community Crops Food Center, and it's another nonprofit that we've worked with in Lincoln that organizes community gardens around the city of Lincoln. It's an organization that's been around for a number of years. They have no facility, they rent an office, they rent storage space, and so they came to us to try to come up with a project that could encompass all of their facilities plus other nonprofits and food-related nonprofits in Lincoln. But one of the things that they do is they organize gardens, particularly to serve immigrant communities in Lincoln, Nebraska. There are actually a lot of immigrants from Africa, Balkans, and other sort of areas of strife in the world. Lincoln is one of the resettlement zones in the United States for refugees, and so they end up in Lincoln, and this organization helps them get access to land to be able to either grow vegetables and produce them themselves, or to be able to grow enough to actually sell. The way they organize, the way they organize their properties is basically these three sides. You either get a small garden, medium, or large, and then they kind of organize their sites appropriately. It's very much sort of variation on the sort of Jefferson grid, where the grid itself is a sort of preconditioned form that is not at all responsive to its inhabitants. Inhabitants have to work within the constraints of this dimension. And we were interested in trying to find a way to organize the garden so that it would actually respond to the needs of the gardeners. And thinking about a more biological model where cells actually have the internal pressure and essentially push back against their neighbors to create a kind of spatial environment that is always in flux. And so we came up with this kind of algorithmic approach to this garden that because they resettle and have to replant every year in the seasons, there's no reason that the same person has to be in the same space every year. So there's an algorithm that generates a spreadsheet for all of the interested farmers and allocates the amount of space that they actually want with a minimum and a maximum size so that it doesn't get too big. And then every year they regenerate this. And they haven't built this garden, they've got the script written so that they regenerate the space for the particular users, and allow it to be a little bit asymmetric so that it starts to become a bit more of an organic kind of grid layout. This is an image of it sitting in the city of Lincoln. It's a full city block near downtown. And at the back of the main building, the building's cantilevers over an outdoor space which they use for outdoor exhibitions and garden sort of demonstrations, outdoor education. But the intention of the building itself is to be a very loose connection and program. So there are zones within the building that can be assigned to different uses and inhabitants, but they're very loose. There's not really any wall space within the building. And the roof itself follows a similar appearance to the landscape, but it's actually based on a structural rationalization of the space frame. And then, so you can see how this curtain is one of the definitions of a public lecture space, but that could be taken away, and then you go to a farmer's market, you can take that over certain parts of the day or certain parts of the week. Seasons. And then the roof itself is a space frame like a glue lamp structure based on certain point loads that are asymmetric, and then it essentially allows us to have a roof garden in certain areas near the heavier loaded areas coming down these piers, and now in the cantilevers it becomes just a translucent roof with a kind of a skylight system built in. And as I mentioned, one of the features of this is an indoor farmers market, which extends the season for produce within Lincoln. Lincoln actually has a very prominent farmers market, so this is a way to sort of extend its life. So this is an example of a project that we did without funding, and it's being used now for fundraising. And within the next couple of years, they hope to be able to break ground and start working on this project. We started this during the sort of economic boom times, and so it's sort of languished for a few years, but now they're interested in maybe pursuing it. This project is similar to the Art Farm's Bean Center for Contemporary Arts. We worked with them, like Art Farm, for a number of years, and it's one of these long-term clients that we keep coming back to. Originally, we did a master plan for a site, and just trying to show it a little bit better. There's a large building, it's about 175,000 square feet, and then a long, low truss building. It's a studio, and a little bit of outdoor space, and then a connection between them across a city street. And our master plan was about giving them opportunities for expanding into the underutilized parts of the building itself. So this is an artist studio, and then on the main floor, we reorganized all the galleries on the main floor and did a couple of projects on the building with fac students. One's called the Info Shop, and one's called the Soft Cube. Those are the two pieces of this that I'm going to show in a little bit more detail. So the Soft Cube is a project that came about in 2008. We were asked to reorganize one of their galleries so to support an event series as opposed to static exhibitions. And if you know about art spaces, the white cube, in fact, this is washed out actually. The white cube is the most common sort of paradigm of contemporary art galleries. It's supposed to be neutral and non-responsive, so the artwork can stand there without competition from the architecture. And so the intention of this was really, quite literally, to soften that space, both acoustically in terms of its environment and create sort of an effective space that is more conducive to the kinds of advanced lectures, music performances that will be held here, along with exhibitions of static artwork. So there's multiple components. There's an acoustical wall. There's HVAC in the space is really bad. So if you're having a dance party, it's a pretty horrendous place to be. So you put a wall of box fans near the door that just move air, and people walk in there and they think, wow, this place is really great. It feels comfortable. It's just the same air being pulled around. It creates a kind of environment that is a little bit more comfortable, at least that's the way people imagine it. We were hired to do this and had some students help us build it. It was a design build project in the office. And we started in May and we finished in about 6 weeks, so it's a very fast process. The design process itself was maybe 2 days of coming up with some ideas and then moving into immediately to sort of fabricating them. So the acoustical wall is just really simply two opposed circles offset by 2 feet, creating sort of a potato chip-like surface, and then optimizing that for construction out of flat materials. With a very low budget, we had to use CDX plywood. If you've ever seen CDX plywood, we put it on a CNC router, it looks like a potato chip already. And so we had, I don't have a picture of this, but we had to actually stand on top of it to hold material down as the router was running around, cutting it, and then very carefully jump over the router as it comes towards you. It actually worked, and no one was damaged. But fortunately, the way we designed it, these pieces fit together in a sort of notched fashion. And so once they came together, everything snapped into place and form emerged quite easily from this really poor material. And then the acoustical quality is maintained and achieved mainly by these slats of homosote. It's sanded homosote, so it has a really leathery, almost suede-like quality to it that are spaced slightly apart. And 2-inch strips, and of course the surface itself doesn't allow it's not a ruled surface, so you can't have a straight material sit nicely on it. So by making the slats fairly small, we hide the discrepancy in the taper inside the joint. So the joint actually goes from about maybe 3/8 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch across the surface, but it's very hard to perceive that. And then the horizontal inserts give it a quality that tends to flatten out when you see it up front, and then as you move around, you start to see that it opens up and starts to take on a much more dynamic form. The bench at the bottom was just something that we decided to do as a way of ending it up at the floor, but it becomes a great place to sit and has a seating for the space. So the other part of this project is the info shop, which is essentially a reception and event space at the entryway to the Venus Center, which is this large brick structure. In the past, the entry was really just a door directly into galleries. There's no place for a staff person, no place for people to sort of hang out or sit down. There's actually no public seating. So when we were working on the master plan, we convinced them that they actually need a place where people could hang out there, otherwise they go in and leave. And so we came up with the notion of a garden on the deck, and then this interior that in the rendering you can sort of see how it opens up to one of the galleries. And then it really is, in a sense, a kind of social condenser that operates during the day as a reception area where they can sell publications. And then at night it becomes a bar, so it transforms into a bar, and they have openings and events in space. It occupies what was part of a gallery. They gave up a bay at one of the galleries in order to build this, and it allows 2 entrances into the gallery. It has different kinds of furniture, a permanently built desk, and then movable seating elements. The desk is made out of horizontally laminated masonry, which has a really beautiful quality, but I would not recommend you do it because that stuff shrinks and expands constantly. And so you have to go back there and wax it. So it gets waxed every year. And so it takes on this really kind of odd character, but it's not maintenance friendly. It has a steel structure, so that it actually cantilevers about 10 feet in one direction as a point. And then the seating is just a soft, upholstered seat set that fits together like a lot. Sort of puzzle when it moves out, it becomes components. And then the wall panels, the idea behind this was to create something that would evoke qualities of the space, sort of dynamism of the art center, but not allow them to actually hang artwork. So it did not want to become a gallery. And so it's an aperiodic tiling pattern composed of 30-60 triangles. And then it, you can see it's a kind of recursive pattern that just continues to duplicate itself at scale. So each triangle can hold 5 other triangles, but then it's aperiodic because it doesn't tile uniformly on a surface. So the area that's sort of selected there, the dotted line, is the zone of the wall that is created out of this pattern. So the 2 red lines of this sort of very large triangle actually become the fold lines 3-dimensionally in space. And then by highlighting certain nodes, we wrote a script that basically edited out the smaller triangles, so 3 different scales, so it creates a kind of gradient that doesn't necessarily exist in the map. And that's a kind of chart you can see. So there's joins between panels, there's routed grooves, and then there are sort of pocketed areas within the surface that in different scales of this triangle. And that shows the deformations. And the desk itself is actually a 3-dimensional extrusion out of this surface. So there's 1 or 2 points where you can stand and see that the desk is actually related directly to the wall. Construction system. And then actually it's Eric standing there sitting here in the audience. Is that you, Eric? So we worked on this during spring semester, and did the wall system during the year, and the desk was finished over the summer. But we came to a realization that we needed to basically grout and surface about 35 panels of MDF, and that the school has a smaller router, and it would do the work that I didn't really want students standing by this router for a whole semester, wishing they were not paying tuition to do that. And so we decided to outsource it and went to the local state prison. And the prison won't allow me to take pictures, so these guys have to stand in for the actual inmates in the prison. It's a medium security prison in Lincoln, part of the state prison system, and they just happen to have this very nice router that they used to make really bad cabinetry. And they actually came to us originally, and this is the first project we were able to do with them, because they wanted the inmates to have better experience using this equipment and learning what to do with it, and making cheap hardware cabinets for state offices was just not very interesting. So we brought them this project and thought about the way that this could be a sort of workforce training. Students actually wrote the code for all of this, the G code for the router. So the inmates are just learning how to sort of set up the job and run it. They actually didn't work on the sort of computer part of the process. We did a couple of tours of the prison, but it's quite a lot of work to get into a medium security prison. Probably a lot more to get out. It did occur to us, though, at one point in this process, that we should have a rule that only for inmates who've been there for 10 years can work on this because they really make good craftsmen. So we started thinking about what does that mean? Okay, bank robbers, and we've done some really bad things over here. Not the guy with 1 month DUI. So we've done 3 projects with them now, and in some cases, projects where they've actually built components, and in this case, they just routed and surfaced the panels, and then the students did all the installation on the framed wall that they constructed. And it comes into the gallery, just sort of meets this sort of pure white wall right at that corner. There's sort of hidden doors within it with concealed hardware. And the monitors are sort of in after that. Originally, we were going to put final letters for information for each show, but the Art Center realized that their annual budget for vinyl lettering was about the same as buying 2 monitors. So they decided to put it into the monitors, and the monitors probably lasted 5 years before they were obsolete. The space directly outside of the window is the garden, and that came about through a very interesting process. We decided, rather than doing a typical design build project, we would actually open this up to the public. And so the Art Center created a space in a gallery that would be a studio. We had work displayed in there. We had models to work with, a projector set up with some work tables, paper you could pull out of the walls to draw on. And we held 12 public charrettes that anyone from the public could come to and participate in a design discussion. Each charrette was run by an artist or an architect who came in and ran a session for 1 day. And my students were sort of the glue between us. They would work in all of these, and so there would be ideas that would come out on the charrettes. The students would work on those ideas for a week and then show them the next charrette, and then the next charrette would take it to another place. And eventually, at the end of all this, we installed the garden. And so I think this space probably has more conversation per square foot than any project I've ever experienced. And it went in so many different directions until finally, at the end of the summer, like, we got to get this thing built, and came up with something probably get done in a week. But it was an interesting way to involve the public in a lot of really interesting conversations about permaculture, about urban space, about this is around occupied Wall Street time, so we're thinking about privately owned public space and what does it mean to create a space people could use, but it's actually privately owned, what happens someplace like etc. So it became a sort of focal point for a lot of interesting conversations that were going on in the city of Omaha at the time. And so in the end, this is after its first year, the planting started to grow, and we had actually one of the worst droughts in history. It's part of the Midwest, so it became a fairly sort of heavily hit zone, but most of the planting survived. I'm just going to show a couple of slides about a current project that we're involved in. This is called the Carver Bank. It's in North Omaha, and we are doing a piece of this project with the artist Astor Gates, who's based in Chicago, and the Rebuild Foundation, and Charlie Vince, who's worked on this, is in the audience. It's a nonprofit that Astor Gates set up to rehabilitate social spaces within very heavily impoverished zones in American cities, typically African-American neighborhoods that are in really bad economic shape. And the idea is to go in and use sort of artist capital to create spaces that afford conversation and help neighborhoods redevelop themselves. So it becomes a kind of catalyst. And he's done this in Chicago, St. Louis, and now Omaha. And our part of it, my students are really working on the exterior realm. There's an interior space that just opened last Friday. And will now be used as a gallery, a sort of work site for resident artists who don't actually live there, they have studio space there. And a soul food restaurant in Omaha opened up a sandwich shop. It's a hub for this neighborhood, which incidentally in Omaha has the highest per capita number of millionaires in the United States and the greatest number of black children in poverty in any city in the United States, which is a really strange thing to think about. That can happen in the same city. And this city is very segregated. I mean, there's neighborhoods, which you just can't imagine occupy the same planet unless the same postal code. So the project involves a lot of recycled materials. This is a shop in Asphalt, and we're working on the sort of interior space and then starting to work on the exterior at the same time. So if you're in Omaha, I recommend you go and see this. My part of the students will be done sometime. Hopefully soon, but we've run into a few issues with our city that isn't always on our side. Might be sound. Pocket Gems is the company that we work with in San Francisco that designs a game for the iPhone. But they actually have a number of games. This is one called Taxi. And it's a kind of game that has a kind of market capitalization that is unprecedented in gaming, because the game itself is free. You buy levels or you buy characters or whatever, and they make ungodly amounts of money off of these games. And they're just stupid games, but so they hired us to design an office space. This company, when they hired us, had 12 people on staff, and asked us to design the space in 3 months so they could grow to 50. And we designed and built the space at a very, very low budget. And it really, the space itself is very simple. It's just a loft environment. Half of it is given to places for people to move off, and half of it goes to people who work. And our sort of design intervention is really limited. These are IKEA desks. There's no budget for anything custom. And so the carpet is really our sort of field of operation in this job, along with a sort of light fixture that we use in the home, and a few other material decisions. Kitchen, which always food. And then the actual work environment, everyone gets about a 5-foot desk, but then they can go and hang out in the lounge. And there's a lot of conference areas, and people with standing desks and sitting desks. I don't know if this slide's going to show on it to really explain this, but this is just a diagram that explains the algorithm used to generate the carpet, which is really based on the interaction of different centers within the space, and then adding other colors and sort of mutual interaction between them generates this pattern. And so the space, basically the orange represents the more public zones, the blue represents where light is entering the building through windows, and then the gray is the sort of neutral field. And then so we started this project in January 2010. It was occupied in June, but they'd already grown to 70 people, so they already maxed out the space before they came in. And so they hired us immediately to look at another building in downtown San Francisco, which is about 300,000 square feet. And then we went ahead and built that up by using the exact same finishes. They didn't go through the design process. But in this case, the space is actually more raw. There's exposed concrete. Given the time and construction speed, we limited our work to furniture, color, carpet, and lighting, and just let the contractor put conduit where they wanted to, fire sprinklers where they wanted to, just let everything be what it was. There's no attempt to try to control any of that stuff. There's normally we try to control very heavily, but in this case we just let it go. And then in China, this is probably the slide. So we were asked to do a project in Zhangzhou, China, which is right between the N and the A there in China. It's a third-tier city in China, population of about 4 million now, but projected to grow to 20 million. And this is sort of the environment we encountered. There's these villas, very expensive houses, and then endless construction towers. It's the kind of common thing that you see all over China. But our site was cornfield, so we were a little dumbfounded, like, why most of harder than Nebraska, that's what we not building cornfields. But it looked pretty much like somewhere outside of Omaha. But it did have these tree plantations that were really beautiful, quite nice. And so we signed a really nice contract. We were all excited about it. Came back and started working, looking at courtyard house, trying to understand sort of spatial parameters within these, and then a really interesting vernacular outside of the city, underground homes with these sort of courtyards that are over the air, the caves that project out from those, and then this sort of classical architecture in the neighboring city. And became interested in how scholar stones and these larger blocks within Chinese gardens and very controlled plantings start to inhabit a surface. And that became a clue for us to think about this really as a garden of houses, and a way of finding it, something that is in a sense of contrast between the sort of conventional understanding of Beijing Hutong as this very dense environment within a city, sort of zone within a city, and then villa development. This is the Bordeaux plan, which is a somewhat American suburban model, and then something that is sort of in between. It has the spatial qualities of the Hutong in the sense of its asymmetries, but the detached houses that were part of the program that's much more like a Bordeaux style project. And we hit upon a pattern in a lot of traditional Chinese architecture, this ice gray. And it's used either in screens and windows or paving. And George Steiner at MIT had developed shape parameters for this. And we started to develop an algorithmic system to generate patterns based on that. So this overall shape area is actually the site. It's 27 acres along a sort of channelized river. And the notion that our sort of target here was to develop 5 neighborhoods of equal area with different shape. And so this problem solver to kind of generate that. So the evolutionary problem solver sort of finds that solution at some point, and I'm not going to run it through. It takes about 4 minutes, and then it kind of ends up with this. And then a second subdivision routine that would let us divide this into 10 lots, and each lot would be a different shape in a different area, so that we end up with an environment that has 90 houses of 10 different types. That's that crazy. And that ends up with this. And so it generates a sort of an ice gray pattern as a sort of urban plan. And then the houses become offsets from that. And then part of it becomes a clubhouse. One of the neighborhoods becomes the clubhouse. There's a sort of organization system, planting system, and there's a separation between vehicular circulation, pedestrian circulation, and working in the ground to facilitate hydrology on the site and then the houses themselves. That's the final site plan. And inside this, we were designing a 6,000 square meter clubhouse, which is the only building that actually uses the same shape grammar as the ice rink we use for the ground plan. And it's composed of a series of spaces around 3 different gardens that have different qualities: Chinese garden, Japanese garden, and contemporary garden. It has a health club, it has restaurants, it has other public spaces that open up into these gardens. And the houses themselves range in size from about 350 square meters to 550 square meters. Each one is generated from the average of all the sites, but then they're distributed on different sites so that they don't necessarily relate directly to the property line of each lot. And then each one is shifted based on an algorithm that instills some feng shui principles into the project required by the client. And so that the houses are shifted away and towards each other, and then windows are adjusted based on that. So each house has this sort of odd outer shape, but then the inner walls are composed along a 6-meter grid, so that we get a fair amount of control on the interior. So these are the 3 the smallest, the medium, and the largest. Sorry, that's a little washed out, but this was actually a kind of parody of Chinese rendering, where there's always a little mist, there's a bird, there's aerial, and always taking at dusk when there's light coming out. But it's a little washed out on the screen. So then we got a phone call from the architects newspaper who said that all these architects in New York were hired by the same people that do this project in China. So it turns out there was some form of scam. We don't quite know what was going on, but apparently they hired all these young architects who had been published but weren't quite well known enough so that we have a job like this. Brought them out there, had them sign these contracts, and then sent them back. And the idea is we didn't actually have to start working until we got paid. We were just excited last week. So the project was some kind of sham, and that was the end of that. But it had an afterlife in an exhibition called Unmade in China, which is an exhibition that was shown in Shanghai and Beijing, and may go to Rotterdam in the next few months. And it included UN Studio, MBRDB, and a number of firms that all had unbuilt projects that, for whatever reason, weren't together. It was sort of a discussion about what was really going on in China, and that a lot of these things tend to sort of happen in odd ways. So the last project I'm going to show is something we're working on right now, and this is a multi-faith chapel for Santa Clara University, which is down near San Jose in Silicon Valley. It's a very wealthy small Jesuit school. And so we were hired to design a small chapel in the interior of this older building here. It's adjacent to their main cathedral, which is actually a mission church. And this was supposed to be a space for everyone who's not a Catholic university, but Catholic students as well. But it's a multi-faith environment, so it has to be open to any group, just a matter of scheduling and so on. There's a little garden that we'll be working on the exterior, and on the interior, this like sanctuary space. So this is just a sort of quick series of images that kind of show our first iteration of the project. And one of the things that we were interested in is trying to create a sort of space where the source of light was very mysterious, but was well lit. And what happens, you look at the ceiling, you start to see the modeling of it. The interior surfaces of all these flat panels are perfectly flat, but then the exterior is very convoluted. And so when light comes in from the outside, it's sort of shielded from the back. So the interest here was finding a way to use digital fabrication not to create an object, but one experiences as an interest in an object like this, but to create an effect that has nothing visually to do with the form, but it's the result of that form and what is there. It was an interesting thing, but it didn't quite work with the client. They thought it was too much like an art gallery or too severe. And so we kind of backed up a little bit, hired some interns, and did some more work. And this is actually just last week, a new iteration, and something that is warmer. It's going to be made with wood, and a bit more straightforward in terms of its sort of architectonic qualities. And I think actually a pretty interesting project. It's sort of the bastard child of Rachel Serra and Takeshi Kawamoto. So the torque to lift was interesting because it's a ruled surface and yet generates a very interesting spatial dynamics. And then Kawamoto's work is interesting because of the apparent sort of chaos from which he sort of creates these installations. This is a relatively old one, but it has this idea of sort of like a cyclone of wood sort of circling around this building. And so our version is takes the rectangular floor plan and adjusts it to this ellipse that's rotated towards the mega, and it's like that's where the rotation comes in, and transforms this wall as a simple stack of rotation of wood members. It's going to be built with post-tension wood, so there's actually no fasteners in this at all. It's just steel cables that run down through the wood, and then it's attached to steel beams underneath the floor, and then post-tension, so the whole thing is just held down with rigid floors, which I think is a sort of elegant way. The students at the university have actually stacked the lumber as part of the process of building this thing. That hopefully will be built next year. It's going to fundraising this summer. And we're still, this is actually a photograph of the model for Friday, so it's still very much in flux. And so I want to just conclude the very brief sort of comment about, I guess, our sort of belief in resisting the culture of no in architecture and trying to produce work that is open to both interpretation but also open to modes of practice. And I'm interested in Dave Hickey's writing this quote. I can't actually remember where this is from, but art and architecture only have to work where they are at. It says a lot about the kind of things we're interested in architecture, that we aren't trying to sort of find a universal principle or mode of practice that we apply at all times, but to simply try to work where we are at a particular time and then move on to something else in the next project. So this is a video in the Soft Keep Gallery just showing an artist who's working on an installation in the face of this piece. So thank you. Nothing exciting.
Time for one.
Jeff, how integral would you say computer algorithms are to your work?
How integral?
So without the okay, let's say, how many projects of yours don't use computer algorithms?
A number of them. I mean, it's not something that we sort of force on a project, but usually if we work with, a parametric model or a script or something, it's to solve a problem that we come up to the project. It's not that we think, wow, this is our chance, we can actually write a script for the project. Great. It's just one of the tools that we can use. I mean, and that may be a kind of a lame answer, but it's actually the truth. We're not trying to seek out a kind of experimentation for its own sake. But when we have the opportunity, we're interested in how we can connect that kind of contemporary process with maybe a more vernacular technique. So a lot of our furniture is potentially, it's generated often with a script or a parametric model or some kind of operative digital process, but then it usually involves some kind of handicraft. We work with a particular furniture maker in Omaha who builds a lot of our custom work and is just a craftsperson, doesn't have any CNC routers or any of that. We outsource that and bring that into the shop and he does his component of work. And so the work tends to be a balance between ways of working. And I think that's maybe one of the things that's a little bit unique about our practice. I mean, we're not interested in being purists about digital technology. There's nothing wrong with integrating a handbook as well in the process. We've got some proof for that, it's part of the work.
The work presents itself as an interesting dialogue between conceptual and the tactile. But there's another thing cutting across it. It's an opportunism, it's a practicality, kind of an entrepreneurship of opportunity. Can you speak to the sources of inspiration for that for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we look at contemporary art a lot. I mean, I'm more interested maybe in contemporary art. My partner studied art history at Brown. She's very interested in work painting. So there's sort of an interplay between her interest in work painting, which is probably the source of most of our color experimentation and some of the formal explorations. And I'm actually more interested in contemporary art and artists who maybe engage issues that are outside of the typical realm of art experimentation. And I think working with Theaster Gates has been really interesting because he's not here, but Charlie is, unfortunately. Theaster's work is very much about this kind of social engagement and applying artist capital in a way that engages individuals and transforms communities, but still can be sort of represented as an art practice. And so we tend to collaborate with artists who are very expansive in that way. And I think that's where a lot of this thinking comes from, and maybe takes us outside of the discipline of architecture a little bit. And I find it kind of refreshing in terms of architectural thought to be engaging with artists who are fairly close but somewhat different in their approach. I don't know if that answers your question.
I love how open you guys are to a lot of different forms of collaboration. I think much more so than most practices. But you're also you're much more vulnerable that way. You're much more susceptible to a lot of different types of things. Can you talk about any experiences of that, just crashing and burning?
That's a good question. I think with crashing and burning is something we haven't really experienced so much in collaborations. I think that the Bemis Garden project, and in the end, it was fine and it's a great project, but the process was just overly burdensome, and it was a lot of conversation. It was way bigger than the project, and it had its own life, but the project itself could have happened easily without that. So in terms of the goal of that project, it wasn't successful, but it was successful for other reasons. We've worked with a number of artists on projects that I've shown, and I have to say they've all been really interesting collaborations, and I don't think we have had one that's fallen apart. There was one project that was a group effort with 3 artists, and one of the artists really got very disturbed with something we were doing in a neighborhood in Lincoln. It was a very large sculptural installation. She felt it wasn't engaging the community in the way she wanted to, and so she just left that process, but it left our office and the 2 other artists who were working on it to complete the project, and it was fine in the end, but it was kind of, I guess, a realization that sometimes those group collaborative efforts don't always work for everyone. The project itself was